how do we deal with the transnational crime?
We looked at intelligence sharing and said, what does that actually mean? What would you need for fraud? The first bank that finds it helps every other bank react. How do you get the legal teams in your organization to be comfortable with sharing this intelligence? I think we're heading in the right direction, but there's more to do.
Welcome, everybody, to the Feedzai Intelligence Network podcast. My name's Lenny Gusel, and I'm here with Greg Williamson from BPI. I think people would be very interested to know who is Bank Policy Institute and BITS within that and your role.
So BITS has been around 30 plus years at this point, really focused on the technology policy side of advocacy. We spend a lot of time on four main areas: fraud reduction, which is where I spend all of my time, cybersecurity, technology risk, and emerging technology. I run a fraud steering committee, which is made up of about 25 different organizations, different banks, and the executive leaders of the fraud group from those banks. And we're also spending a lot of time looking at how can we actually advocate in the fraud arena, right? Banks do a lot to help prevent fraud. So we spend a lot of time talking about what those problems are that our fraud professionals, the fraud executives are facing, and what we can do to help them.
I want to kind of focus our conversation today on something I know that you're also concentrating on, which is how do we move the industry forward with regard to information sharing?
We've been spending almost probably 2 or 3 years now with our members talking a lot about how should sharing be improved. To your point, banking fraud has been doing sharing for 30 plus years. Even in our forums that have been in existence, that discussion of the people you know, right? The discussion, get in a room, talk about the trends you're seeing. We looked at it a couple of years ago with members and said, one of the things we need to do is make this more scalable and achievable, right? Make sharing and intelligence sharing something that is actionable. And it's not easy, right? There's a lot of banks who do good sharing, and are involved in a lot of forums, but not all of the banks are there. And so what we wanted to look at is how do we enhance it? We kind of took a view of it, and one of my peers actually kind of created what we call a three-tier strategy. First piece we looked at was data sharing. So data sharing is, in our view, kind of a structured, actionable set of data, right? I need these 3 fields, provide me these 3 fields, they'll go into this database. It can be received in a way either to be fed into a vendor's model or to be fed into a proprietary model at an institution to help determine and make a risk decision in real time or near real time.
And it's, when you say data, to be clear, you're talking about what we would categorize as PII.
Could be PII, could be any form of structured data, right? Sometimes it is PII, right? Like a good example is, how do you share the bad beneficiary information of a mule account or what banks are seeing? How do you do that? Not because they're all necessarily bad, right? But so that banks can use that to determine, hey, I'm receiving money or I'm sending money to a certain organization. Has this been seen? It's a signal, right? It's a signal that can be leveraged. And I think, sometimes it can be PII, and that brings all kinds of challenges and where the complexity lies in how you do these models, these sharing models. But, other times it may be less stringent data that can be put out there that may be beneficial. The second piece we looked at is intelligence. And I think this is something that's done very well traditionally in the cyberspace, right? In cybersecurity. The cyber world has done intelligence sharing for much longer. There's actually, in some cases, better legal ability to share intelligence. It's often less PII related, to your point, right? So we looked at intelligence sharing and said, what does that actually mean? What would you need for fraud? And the way we think about it really is tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this is more kind of the high-level trend type information of what a bank may be seeing. Specific examples are, I'm seeing a check fraud trend, check fraud new accounts, right? The perpetrators opening new accounts, depositing this type of check in this region, right? A very simple example, right? Distributing that out at scale then allows all these other institutions to look, am I seeing that same trend, right? A lot of times what we've found, and we've got examples as more and more of this occurs, banks who don't know that they have this trend occurring, all of a sudden see that kind of alert that comes up on a screen or in an email or on some other automated system. I'll talk about kind of how we're pushing that today. All of a sudden you get that information you have an analyst be able to look at that on a regular basis and they start to find things more quickly that you didn't know you had, right? Whether it be new types of scams, or the check fraud scenarios I brought up, new account frauds in certain regions. We all know fraud happens in patterns, but what we also know is typically criminals aren't just attacking Bank A or Bank B. They're doing it across the board when they find a gap and they start to see, do others have the same gap? And then they attack, right? So the more that occurs, it's good for the bad guys. The more that we share and can say, here's the trends we're seeing, the first bank that finds it helps every other bank react. And so as we looked at that, right, so how do you do it? How do you speed that up? We go back to what's occurred over the last several years of, meetings and forums and sharing that through one-on-one discussions. How do you make that actionable? How do you make that scalable? We worked specifically at first with the FSISAC, right? FSISAC is a cyber sharing organization, used by pretty much every bank in the U.S. And what we did with them is say, how do we use your sharing rails? They have technical capabilities to provide this TTP type information, so banks can submit it either through email or some of their platforms, and then have that distributed out widely to the intelligence teams that are taking that back in. So we worked very closely with them, and ISAC kind of championed this in terms of let's use our members. Let's actually start to bring some of the fraud people, the fraud leaders who truly understand fraud to the table. And then the next question is, okay, if I can get it in there, how do you get it out? And how does a central point kind of analyze it and make it more actionable? So I think developing those templates was critical. What we worked with ISAC on is developing also output, right? So having a monthly report of here's the fraud trends we're seeing across the industry, right, that are being reported in, right? Real-time alerts that come out when they get those, inputs from banks. And then monthly calls to talk about the trends that they're analyzing and seeing at the industry level now, right? So I think there's still a lot more work to do, but it was a starting point to establish a set of automated or technical rails where data could be shared. Intelligence should be shared. And that's hard. I fall for it too, right? Like breaking these things apart and being very crisp about what we're talking about, whether it's data sharing or intelligence sharing, right? ISAC's been really good at trying to build out the intelligence sharing capabilities and make it more scalable for banks to share that intelligence.
It's so critical. I have some questions for you about that specifically, but I want to just hone in on what you said there in terms of how much work we have to do even to develop the language, and the kind of the conceptual structures of distinguishing between what is a consortia, what is data sharing, what is intel sharing, what is a collaborative network, and what are the rails you call them, what are the technical rails, and how do we operationalize this? But I want to first go to your third pillar.
Okay. Yeah. So third pillar is around law enforcement case sharing, right? So the intention is how do you share enough evidence or intelligence, right, about, going back to intention. Intelligence, what I just talked about with some of that FSISAC work, is even more so, I would argue, prevention, right? Can we share trends that we're seeing so that we can make sure, one, other banks know this is what's occurring in my region or in this region. You should all look at it and see if you have that same thing. We get to schemes quicker. It's better for the industry. The intent of that last piece of law enforcement is how do I build cases that collaborate, right? We always know going back, Bank A, Bank B, and Bank C are typically attacked by the same groups, the same individuals. Building cases and getting law enforcement involved is difficult, right? A lot of banks have that challenge. Financial institutions struggle with that. It's a challenge to get law enforcement to pick up a case. Each organization or each agency may have a different criteria. So by bringing that together and kind of making sure that case, that the data and information and intelligence that can be shared for that case collaboration, and then instead of bringing one case for X amount of money, you're bringing a packaged case to law enforcement. And this is actually what NCFTA does to a T, right? This is where they're really good, bringing that case, bringing law enforcement to the table on these discussions. What's needed is more clarity on what's valuable to bring to law enforcement. How do you get more banks to contribute or financial institutions to contribute to these capabilities so that the cases get bigger, there's more clarity on what to provide, and And that there's ultimately that last piece. The intention is, how do we get some of these criminal organizations more effectively off the street?
Yeah, and it's a great breakdown, and really it's looking at um, how do we define different types of collaborative sharing mechanisms across the life cycle of fraud risk management or financial crime or economic crime management. I know, having been in seat, it's on that law enforcement collaboration, it's critical.
Yes.
And as you said, it's really challenging. You're either at the receiving end of a subpoena request, and the amount of tooling and infrastructure used even and process needed even to just do that effectively, or you're trying to take an actual ring out and be able to get law enforcement engaged effectively in the right agency at the right point at the right time, and to do it not just as one institution, but to be able to really empower them to take action. I think how you've broken that down is really powerful and important.
Yeah, it definitely helps. It's helped move some of this forward, right? I talked about the work ISAC has done to launch their fraud program, right? And CFTA and ISAC are looking at how do they, engage better together. It's also, how do you get people participating? So you can build the rails, you can build the capabilities, but you need people contributing that intelligence. You need people pushing the active data. You need organizations building the tool to push the data into the APIs on a data sharing perspective. So it takes resource, right? And it competes against any other fraud reduction. But to do it effectively, one of the things we learned is you've got to have that resource, or you've got to have at least a little bit of time to have people contribute this stuff, to contribute the intelligence, right? And you also, I think more importantly, is where the challenge comes in is legal and regulatory, right? How do you get the legal teams in your organization to be comfortable with sharing this intelligence? So I know we've done, as a number of others have, but we've done some research on and work with legal agencies, legal entities, and some of our outside counsels to basically show that, things like 314B are an avenue to share data, and ultimately should be enabling banks to share that information.
That this isn't about just preventing a particular fraud typology or taking down a particular fraud ring. That this is really the health and soundness of our entire financial ecosystem, and frankly, more broadly than that. And I think we haven't even gotten to cross-industry collaboration and sharing, which we will, but it's really about a whole of society problem that we're now in. It's no longer a fraud or scam prevention problem. It is how do we deal with the transnational crime? How do we deal with, if you folks, those of us who are keenly supporting and following the work of people like Aaron West in Operation Shamrock, and starting to get a level of understanding of how big this problem is at a society level. And to put some of these numbers in perspective, what we found is 8% of the U.S. population was impacted, fell victim to some kind of an online cyber-enabled fraud or scam last year. That's approximately 21 million people, which amounts to approximately 57,000 people per day. So I think a lot of folks lose context of 1 billion, 12 billion, 100 billion, like the loss, that there's the loss aspect of it.
Yeah.
But the society level impact that we're in is why we're here talking about how do we raise the bar on these various types of collaborative sharing arrangements that are necessary.
Yeah, we've been very focused with our banks on a couple key ecosystems. First, one is telecom, right? Big challenge that we have is the spoofed phone calls, that appear to come from a bank's phone number, and then the text messages. And I think those are two forms, right? One that actually directly impersonate a bank in the messaging, and two that, are designed to collect information about payment credentials. The thing we all get now is that these toll scams, right? Like those come out at scale. So a couple of things we've done is made some very specific asks work directly in two ways, right? Industry to industry, between telcos and social media, bringing a group of banks together. We've launched a couple work groups here where we've got a group of banks that can provide information about the texts that they're seeing, how they're detecting them, because they get them reported directly from their consumer, and then bringing that over to the telecom providers to allow them to say, what can you do here? We need takedown. Takedown is the first thing. Can you take down these numbers so they stop sending the text, right? Fortunately, once they take it down, they do tend to go to the next number and get a new number and keep working through it. But what we want to do is be able to get that information, share that information, so they can stop and take down those numbers. I think there's two-way requests that we're also making, right? What the banks really are looking for, what we're trying to figure out is how can we also get the numbers that either telecoms are identifying that are sending possible scam messages, right? Because those do a couple things. That gives banks the ability to now know that maybe Greg is more high risk because he's got this message, maybe he's interacted with that message. Two, there's really critical information for banks in that. A lot of times they contain links to smishing or phishing sites, right? And the banks need to take that down because the quicker they get those sites taken down, the less customers that are going to be impacted. So we've done a lot of work with kind of between those sectors to try to figure out how do you make that occur. It's been slow. I think there's a lot of kind of bilateral agreements that are ongoing because there is some legal sharing challenges, I think, that exist. There's been a lot of education. I think where we've had to start across the entire telecom community is education about how this is impacting a shared consumer and how their technology or their platforms is actually enabling that fraud to occur. I think also there's a difference between what we've learned is there's a difference between a large telecom provider and a smaller telecom provider in terms of the capabilities to detect this type of activity. So we think it's really important also to bring to the table when there's a mobile virtual network operator, basically the smaller providers who ride on the rails of the bigger providers. How can the bigger providers make sure they're doing what the smaller providers are doing what they need to do to actually prevent and share information back to the banks to help identify this? So that's the sharing piece, at least with telcos.
How do you see that evolving? What if you can kind of shed some light on the conversations for, because now we're getting into the product and technology domain of how will we actually enable this?
Right. Yeah, I think that two-way sharing is critical, right? Like, so taking a specific example, banks providing that information, the text that they see, the spoofs they call. We need to work together to provide a set of standards that we understand what banks should provide. And that can funnel through one organization to be able to technically put those capabilities in, the text, in an automated manner, the text, the content, the numbers, and maybe a request of what they want done with it. And then that needs to be funneled to the telecom industry to incorporate that in. Because going back to a challenge, one of the challenges that exists today is I get 1,000 numbers. That could be across 10 different carriers. And then I need to go interact with each one of those. So working with the other trade organizations and some of the big telecoms, how can we get them to also build a capability that allows the input of that information in a standardized manner to distribute out to all those? So we're looking at how do you build kind of a centralized capability through existing sharing capabilities and allow the telecoms to have one spot to come pick that up. Yeah. I think, honestly, what I would like is I would really like that to be provided by the telecom industry, right? Provide us a capability where we can just send you what we need, and then they can figure out what to do with that.
We know that a key hurdle that's there is how do you make it permissible? How do you create the safe harbors that are necessary for highly regulated industries like banking, like telco,
right?
To be able to share this information in a way that facilitates solving the problem without creating a liability issue.
Mm-hmm. I think, you hit the nail on the head. It's creating the safe harbors. And how do we do that, right? I think there's a couple things. One, it's understanding, right? Like, what's blocking today? The blocking, I believe, is more the fear of retribution. If I put a piece of information in an exchange, there's false positives that can occur within that, right? Am I going to be, if I'm doing the best interest of trying to protect a platform and share information because I believe there's a criminal involved in that, what stops people from doing that is they don't want to be held accountable for that. And I think that safe harbor is critical. So I do think there eventually will need to be some legislative capabilities that provide for sharing of information, that allow this cross-sector sharing with the intention of preventing fraud, that is not gonna that alleviates that accountability. I believe we've seen it now, sure, with some of the new Australia rules,
Yeah.
providing some of those safe harbors.
Yeah.
Right. If you're providing through their sharing capabilities that they've built through ACFX and other tools that they have there,
Yeah.
in order to bring some of those other sectors to the table and to get the financial services comfortable or more comfortable with sharing that data, they provide those safe harbors. Right. And I think that's what's lacking here. I think that's a challenge for the banking industry. I think it's a challenge for big tech. Is there needs to be clarity that sharing for fraud purposes will not result in some sort of damage back to that organization who has the right intention.
That legislative aspect, the fact that we need to get to a point where there's given the size and scale and complexity of the problem, that we need both federal and state level legislative action in order to create these kinds of safe harbors and clear permissible structures for the kinds of collaboration that we know needs to be enabled. What's that conversation look like now among your members, and where's the needle going to be moved in order for I'll wade into tricky territory here a little bit. We have this opportunity, it seems, certainly in the U.S.
Yeah.
to go outside of the regulatory conversation of, we should place liability on the banks to do X, Y, Z, and instead put ourselves and focus on how do we enable the kinds of innovation
Yeah.
and capability as a whole of society approach in order to make it better, faster, easier for banks to share amongst themselves, to collaborate with industry. Where's that conversation like, and where's the needle going to get moved on that legislative aspect?
I can't predict exactly what will happen legislatively, but I think what we can do here in the U.S. is learn from what's happened in other countries. I don't think everything that happened in Australia will work here in the U.S., but I think there's principles there that are really important, right? I think they took an approach of, hey, in order to address this problem, we need sectors to put preventative capabilities in place to stop the scammers where they're at.
Industry sectors,
Industry sectors.
where the various, I'm saying scams in general, where the various types of criminal attacks trying to get to our monies are actually originating. And that's been their legislate. That's been a big part of their legislation.
So telecoms, social media, big tech, financial services all have a role to play. And they incented those organizations to put preventative capabilities in place, to participate in information sharing, right? To help with consumer education. That is part of where they're headed with their legislation. And we think that's a critical aspect to actually preventing the scams and attacking the criminals, is actually getting everybody to the table to take action. And if you don't take action, there is a punishment. Right? Meta has brought Fire Exchange to Australia as well. Some of the capabilities they put in place, the fact that legislation was being worked on the last 18 months in a really collaborative manner between their government and the industry, drove people to the table. And, I think the latest report that came out, 2 weeks ago from Australia was they're down, I think their scam volume is down 25%. Their scam reports, their scam losses are down 25%. And so they're seeing impact there because they put a focus on preventing the scam.
Coming back to the kind of the banks and what we in the banking community need, I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what you think are the legislative actions required here in order to facilitate and free up the kinds of data, intel, and collaboration that we know are necessary, even just amongst the banking community, to create those kinds of safe harbors.
I don't think it's just legislative, to be honest, but to answer that more specifically, I think as we talked about earlier, the main thing is clarity on information sharing, right? The main thing is getting very direct clarity from groups like FinCEN on fraud sharing is allowed. right? Because there's still a lot of uncertainty there. No matter how many opinions have been issued, there's still uncertainty because it tends to come with some buts in any issuance that's given. So I think that's the first piece. And then I think it's the, providing a safe harbor. Having legislation that can provide that safe harbor for institutions within the organization, within the banking industry, to be able to share without recourse. I don't know that legislation necessarily will be passed in the U.S. similar to Australia, right, in our current environment. I think it's piecing together those small parts that we can drive more clarity. It's getting clarity on, is 314B enough, right? And should banks be using it? I think we need, to make sure that's clear and getting banks comfortable with that. I also think, like I said, it's the piece around giving that safe harbor, because one of the things that's become more clear to me as we've engaged deeper in this discussion is, 314B doesn't apply to these other sectors that we also need intelligence from and we also need data from.
Well, I'll jump in here and I'll say something that I don't think should be controversial. In that 314B is not enough and it was not designed for the kinds of real-time intel sharing that we're talking about in order to get further up the life cycle of being able to take action in real time and to be able to deal with the speed and
one-to-many.
The one-to-one and the speed and scale of the attacks that we're seeing. We have such a large multitude of fraud problems that are all real-timey in nature, and 314B wasn't as a mechanism. We're making assumptions here. It's a specific provision, specific BSA provision that allows information sharing, and there's a very specific protocol and standard of being able to submit a request for that and do that kind of sharing. It is not at all designed for doing real-time intel sharing in the way that you described, as where you talked about the key problem or the key need that we have right now. So I don't think that should be controversial.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I think 314B has its place, right? And it's important for a lot of the sharing that it's been able to enable over time. It's been leveraged to help drive fraud sharing today. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's value in what 314B can provide, but it doesn't hit all of the pieces we ultimately
that we've been discussing here,
right? Yeah. So there is, there's lots of legal opinions. We've worked on some legal opinions that say, hey, it does apply to fraud, right? And fraud organizations should share based on the fact that it enables them to. So I think that's a good starting point. I do think as we get into where sharing has evolved, it's not just banking. It's multiple sectors, it's different use cases, it's a need for real-time interaction, right? Real-time interdiction, put it in a rule and let it be used in analysis.
And real-time intelligence signals sharing, as opposed to as I talked about before, a deterministic knowledge of something that was in fact fraud.
Yes, I think that is where there's opportunity for additional legislation, regulation, whatever it may be, to provide those safe harbors, to give that cross-sector capability of sharing. That's where we're going to need to get to. So I think it's a baseline that allows sharing to occur today that we should leverage where we can, but there needs to be more, and there needs to be more clarity to make that occur.
Greg, you and I know that there's such a multitude of organizations created from scratch, or existing organizations that have really focused themselves on all of the various aspects that are needed in order to get a whole of society kind of approach. There's the Noble, there is Operation Shamrock, we talked a bit about, and there's I think the FSISAC and CFTA that we discussed, and then I know that you and others have been involved in very importantly with the Aspen Institute. Having them really facilitate this kind of cross-industry, whole of society kind of approach. Maybe if you can share a little about that.
Right. One of the things that we know is important is collaboration. One of the things that we've been very actively engaged in terms of how do we get all of these sectors together is actually what was formed back in September timeframe of last year through the Aspen Institute, the National Fraud Task Force. And I think this was a really important step forward to bring together multiple sectors, inclusive of financial institutions, retail, social media, tech, fintechs, law enforcement, really bringing together, and actually also national consumer groups, right? Representing the consumer in this discussion is really important. Bringing all of that together into a way that we can actually try to figure out, with the growing fraud, with the growing scams, what can be done, what should be done, what is the actual policy recommendations that we want to put out there that support everybody, that support all of those sectors. As part of the Aspen Institute, they had stood up a set of work groups starting in October. Those work groups focused first on what we just talked about today, cross-sector information sharing. How do you improve? What are the impediments to cross-sector information sharing? Second was law enforcement. What are the challenges that law enforcement has? What are the challenges that industry has engaging with law enforcement? And how do we identify those? The third was around consumer awareness and intervention strategies. So what type of campaigns would be valuable to make sure that consumers understand all of these schemes that are hitting them, as well as what should organizations and industry be doing to insert intervention, right? Or interdiction, however you use it, but basically messages at the point where you need it. If I'm doing a transaction online, getting that message at that time for the right risk around, hey, are you sure you want to be sending this money? Who are you sending it to? Are you sure you did that, right? Getting that in front of the consumer to make them think twice. Also doing that in other avenues, right? At the social media messaging standpoint, at the marketplace standpoint, making sure that occurs. So that's that third consumer awareness group. And then the fourth is around metrics. How do we measure? Because one of the problems we have right now in fraud and scams, however you group that, is measurement of the problem, right? There's multiple ways that's reported through the FTC, through the FBI's capabilities, IC3. There's trade organizations that have, there's too many. So how do we get metrics? What are the right metrics to measure the problem and to see success as we're moving forward? So the first kind of set of work groups was really designed to bring up the challenges, the impediments, the ideas that people have to get around those. And where the task force is going next is, how do we put together a set of policy recommendations and capability recommendations about what needs to be done in the U.S. to enable information sharing through things like, is there legislation that's needed from a safe harbor perspective? Is there capabilities that need to be built? What's needed to provide law enforcement the capabilities and resources all the way down from the federal to the local level and state, and then getting the metrics in place, recommendations around, should there be a kind of national anti-scam center that coordinates the collection of all that information. I think one of the things I've learned in my role is that there's lots of focus on cyber with CISA, National Security Council, across all organizations. I think one of the things we've recognized is that there actually isn't somebody who is kind of spearheading fraud in the government, right? We've seen a fraud head, I'll use that word, right? Like the czar of fraud in the UK. And that was an important step forward for driving things. Australia's had some similar approaches, but I think that is something we think is really important in the US. This is a huge problem for consumers, fraud, scams, and it's really about the consumer. If we want to protect consumers, we need a national coordinated effort. The National Task Force helps drive recommendations to that, but we really need, I think it's important to have government really look at how fraud affects our economy and affects consumers, and have somebody who's in charge of that. I think that's an important step forward.
So I think this allows us to go into conceptualize here a little bit. What do you think is needed? Like, what will work? And if I may, I'm here with an interest of, how do we facilitate impact? How do we help our customers, prospective customers, be able to have these kinds of tools and technologies? Because as we know, vendors have been one of the ways that the industry has solved this problem. And whether the vendor is of the industry itself, like an EWS, or the vendors are multitude of others who have some kind of I'll use the C word, who have some kind of consortia, I'll call it. But we know we know that the kind of the vendor community is one of the places that's going to facilitate this kind of innovation, and facilitate this kind of information sharing and make it as real-timey as possible. What do you think, I mean, you can speak here as Greg or on behalf of kind of Bits here, how do you envision this happening, and how would you frankly even advise vendors like us for where can we be most helpful?
I'm going to say something maybe you won't agree with, so this might be a good discussion. I think when we talk about data sharing, we talk about how do we make it work. I think it's really important to think about, I've got key data attributes or elements that I need to put I'm going to keep it simple, in a database, right? In a container, and I need everybody to do that the same way. And the most important thing there is I need that to hit scale. I need it to be the majority of the benefit of that. So in this case, the banks. I need a lot of banks participating. And so I think what's needed is kind of I think it's important to separate, how do you share that data, and separate kind of, should we go with vendor A versus vendor B?
Agreed.
And then allow on top of that, right? So a container that enables sharing of whatever that is. We're going to talk about structured data. It could be multiple fields, but someplace kind of like what AWS does today, or original intent of it, put all that data in one spot. I think there should be a layer above that. And that's where differentiation occurs, right? How do you use that layer? Whether I'm an independent bank, or I'm a bank who has the capability to make my own models, incorporate data into my system, right, to make models, or I want to use a vendor, and they can leverage that to enhance their models and their capabilities for their clients. I do think there's an importance, and I think, some of the models that have worked in other countries focus on that, right? A centralized container of the data, and I put it this way, the dumb data. It's valuable, but it's just structured data until it's put into a model is where it gets much more valuable. And so I think keeping those two things separate is really important. And I think it's important going back to, so it engages, so it gets the actual, you're not choosing, should I go A or B as the fraud vendor? I'm putting everything, and then let the market figure out who's doing the best analysis on top of that data.
You're talking about something that really that we are spending a lot of time, not just time, we're spending a lot of dollars investing in. How do we build the tool sets, the toolkits into our technology stack? Anyone who is working with us, not only can they have the necessary tools, but how do we enable them to participate in an ecosystem? Because there isn't a complete data pool anywhere. And there's multiple different types of intelligence. Just for fun, I'll go to one that I know you and I and many others have been talking about for a long time, which is, can we see device IDs? I know it's
9 years ago.
15 years ago.
We've talked about this for a long time, right? And I think if you take the device ID, I worry sometimes that maybe we get, when it comes to the data sharing piece and using device as an example, we get caught up in the perfect versus the close, right? And I think, not everybody uses the same device ID. There's different ways to calculate it, right? Different capabilities, but depending on the mobile device I'm using in terms of what I can capture. But, I feel like there's probably, over time, there's been ways we could get to something that can be used across multiple companies, and can also get to a point of like all the differentiator vendors can also leverage that for what they need. I feel like, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I feel like we've struggled as an industry to get to like, there's good enough in this. And if we could get the data for good enough, then let the companies that do like what you guys do and others, let them differentiate on what we provide in that centralized manner.
There's I'll call it kind of an old school fraud risk management mentality of having a deterministic piece of data.
Yeah.
That is the confirmed account at which a fraud has occurred, the confirmed device on which a fraud has occurred, as opposed to a probabilistic set of signals,
Mhm.
and that you can use those signals either to generate scores, or you can use those signals as attributes in and of themselves in order to facilitate an appropriate risk-based decision
Right.
at some point in the customer journey of interacting with the bank. Um, so I think what you're describing is um, the kind of the thinking that we fall back into, that we need a definitive deterministic attribute
Right.
as opposed to a set of attributes and signals
Yes.
that can be instrumented effectively
Yeah.
in order to appropriate risk-based management. And I think that is where I think we as a vendor and many other vendors, I think, have a big role to play,
Yeah.
because it requires experimentation. It requires bringing to bear the kinds of tools that are available now in order to drive continuous experimentation with how do you derive those kinds of really, we're coming back to our beginning conversation. It's using all of the available tools of data science and AI for how do you derive derive the kinds of data features
Yeah.
that have signal strength.
Mhm.
And how do you enable organizations to experiment with how to create those signals and how to put them into a structure such that they can be shared, and such that you can facilitate these kinds of collaborative intel networks, that those attributes can then be used
Right.
effectively, whether to by in and of themselves to make a decision, or improve a model or models. I think that's how I think about
Yeah.
that kind of layer, as you talked about it,
Mm.
that we need to put on top of the traditional approach of let's pool the data.
Yep.
Yes, we need to pool the data. Those will be a very important and effective
Yeah.
capabilities. But on top of that, where are the data pools?
Right.
Is how do we enable? How do we use the technology available today to facilitate experimentation, rapid iteration with creating the kinds of creating and sharing the kind of signals that are going to move the needle?
I'm encouraged at the fact that there is much more focus on actionable sharing of information, and a recognition that it is valuable. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but there's more to do.
I
Yeah.
just really want to thank you for coming in and
Thanks for
talking
having me.
with us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully this was super valuable for me. Frankly, a gift to be able to have this kind of conversation with you.
Yeah.
The fact that we can kind of record it and share it with others.
Yeah.
Uh,
I always
I'm
enjoy our
encouraged about that.
discussions.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is very helpful. Very good discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me in.
Yeah. Pleasure. Thanks, Greg.